The Kenyan capital of Nairobi has been rocked by violent protests for the third consecutive day as police forces and demonstrators clashed in the streets. Authorities declared the rallies illegal, but that did not deter the large crowds of angry citizens who took to the streets to demand accountability from their government. The protests were prompted by a sharp rise in inflation and allegations of corruption in the last presidential election. Kenyans have been struggling to make ends meet as prices for basic necessities such as food and fuel continue to soar. The government's response to the crisis has been criticized as inadequate, and many Kenyans feel that their voices are not being heard. The protests started peacefully but quickly turned violent as police forces used tear gas and water cannons to disperse the crowds. Demonstrators responded with stones and other objects, setting fires and blocking roads with burning tires. Several buildings were also set on fire, including a police station and a petrol station. The situation quickly escalated, with reports of widespread looting and property damage. Shops were ransacked, and vehicles were set on fire. The chaos forced many businesses to close their doors, and residents were advised to stay indoors. As the protests continued, the Kenyan government issued a statement condemning the violence and calling for calm. They also warned that those responsible for the unrest would be held accountable. However, the statement did little to quell the anger of the protesters, who continued to demand change. They are calling for an end to corruption and for the government to take action to address the rising cost of living. Many are also calling for the resignation of President Uhuru Kenyatta. The protests have drawn international attention, with many expressing concern about the situation in Kenya. The United Nations has called on all parties to exercise restraint and work towards a peaceful resolution to the crisis. The Kenyan government has responded by deploying additional police forces to the streets, and there are reports of arrests being made. However, the protests show no signs of slowing down, and many fear that the situation could escalate further. The unrest in Nairobi is just the latest in a series of protests and demonstrations that have taken place across the African continent in recent years. From Sudan to Zimbabwe, citizens have taken to the streets to demand change and hold their leaders accountable. Many believe that the protests in Kenya could mark a turning point for the country, as citizens continue to demand transparency and accountability from their government. The outcome of the crisis remains uncertain, but one thing is clear: the people of Kenya are determined to make their voices heard, no matter the cost.